Imagine a courthouse where power was meant to protect the weak, but instead, it became a shield for the guilty. Whispers spread like wildfire. An abuser, guilty in the eyes of the people, was about to walk free because of a judge who had long sold his conscience to corruption. The city held its breath, helpless, watching justice twist into injustice. But that silence would not last. On the horizon, the roar of engines grew louder, echoing like thunder through the streets, announcing that someone was about to challenge the untouchable. It was not lawyers, not politicians, not even the police who stood up to the man in the black robe. It was a brotherhood feared and respected in equal measure, a biker gang whose loyalty to the innocent was stronger than any chain of intimidation the judge had forged. They did not come with polished speeches or paperwork. They came with presence, with defiance, with a message carved into every mile of asphalt they had conquered together. And when they rolled up to the courthouse, helmets shining under the sun, no one could ignore them. The judge thought he was untouchable, hidden behind walls of authority and connections that stretched into the shadows. But when the bikers cornered him, there was no more hiding. His gavel could not silence their voices, his title could not erase their fury, and his polished shoes could not step over the truth they carried. The gang became the voice of the silenced, the shield of the broken, the force that no amount of corruption could bend. The crowd gathered, drawn by the impossible sight. Men branded by society as outlaws now standing as protectors of a mother and her child. Murmurs turned to cheers, fear turned into courage, and the weight of the judge's corruption finally cracked beneath the weight of unity. For the first time, the city saw a different kind of justice, one that didn't wear robes or speak in legal terms, but burned raw and untamed in the hearts of those who refused to let evil win. This was not just a confrontation. It was a reminder that when those entrusted with justice betray it, the people will rise in unexpected forms, unrelenting and unforgettable. And on that day, with engines rumbling and courage unshaken, the bikers wrote a story no courtroom could ever erase. A story of defiance, of protection, and of a mother who would no longer stand alone. The tension inside the courthouse had been thick, suffocating almost, as the gavel came down with a sound that felt like betrayal. Families of victims gasped, some even cried out, but the decision was made. The abuser would walk free. The judge's cold stare dared anyone to challenge his word, and for a moment, despair settled in like a heavy fog. It seemed as though the walls themselves had conspired to protect the guilty and abandon the innocent. But outside, the air carried a different energy, restless, unyielding, like a storm gathering strength. The rumble of engines had started faint, a whisper of defiance, but now it grew into a symphony of rebellion. Each motorcycle carried not just a rider, but a story, a reason of fire. To some, these men were outlaws, rebels on the fringe of society. Yet to those who had been silenced too long, they were the embodiment of courage, riding with the promise that no one would be left unprotected. The doors of the courthouse shook as heavy boots stepped onto the marble floor, one after another. Helmets under arms, tattoos on display. The bikers walked in with the kind of authority that no robe could command. Their eyes locked on the judge, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat for the first time in years. The balance of power in the room had shifted, not because of laws or politics, but because a line had been drawn, and those men dared anyone to cross it. Mothers clutched their children tighter, not in fear of the bikers, but in awe of the way they stood. Fathers who had felt helpless now raised their heads, emboldened by the sheer presence of men who lived by their own code of loyalty and protection. The silence broke, not with screams or chaos, but with a sense of hope spreading like wildfire among those who had almost given up. The bikers had not come to destroy, they had come to defend. And in that moment, the judge realized the gravity of his mistake. He had not just betrayed justice, he had provoked the guardians of it. What once had been hidden in the shadows was now exposed under the unflinching eyes of men who feared nothing, not even the weight of the law twisted by corruption. The air pulsed with anticipation, the first sparks of a confrontation that no one present would ever forget. The leader of the gang stepped forward, a tall man with scars that told more stories than words ever could. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of thunder as he spoke directly to the judge. You thought your seat made you untouchable. You thought power meant freedom from consequence. But today, you'll see power belongs to those who protect, not those who exploit. Every syllable cut through the courtroom like a blade, silencing even the whispers. The judge tried to respond, to assert control, but his words faltered. For years, his arrogance had been his armor, but now it crumbled under the collective gaze of men who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. He reached for his gavel, as if the sound of its striking could still command obedience, but no one moved. The crowd's eyes were not on him anymore. They were on the bikers, waiting, trusting. Behind the gang leader stood dozens of riders, each one unflinching, each one ready to face whatever storm might follow. They did not speak, but their silence was louder than any chant, a wall of solidarity that carried more weight than laws scribbled on paper. Every victim in that room saw their pain mirrored in those silent faces, and for the first time, they felt their suffering was not invisible. The mother at the center of it all clutched her child close, tears welling in her eyes, but not from despair. For the first time, she felt she was not alone. Strangers, men whose names she did not know, had made her fight their own. Her child, once trembling in fear, now looked at the bikers with wide eyes, seeing in them a kind of heroism the world rarely admits exists. And while the walls of the courthouse had been built to uphold order, on that day, they bore witness to something deeper, the raw, unfiltered demand for justice from those who refused to let corruption silence them. The confrontation had only just begun, but already the city would never see that courthouse, that judge, or those bikers the same way again. The judge's hands trembled ever so slightly, though he tried to mask it behind a stern face. For the first time in decades, his authority meant nothing. The courtroom, once his domain, had turned into a stage where his corruption stood exposed under the blazing light of truth. He scanned the faces before him, victims, families, bikers, and realized he had lost the one thing he depended on most: fear. The leader of the bikers leaned forward, his voice low, almost steady, but laced with menace. You don't answer to us. You answer to them. He extended his hand toward the rows of mothers, fathers, and children whose lives have been scarred by injustice. Look into their eyes and tell them why you try to free the man who broke them. The words hung heavy, slicing through the silence like shards of glass. The judge shifted, beads of sweat forming at his temple. He opened his mouth, but the words choked in his throat. The very people he had silenced with rulings and technicalities were now staring at him, their eyes burning with the hunger for accountability. For once, he couldn't hide behind paperwork, nor behind the shadows of his wealthy allies. He was cornered, not by threats, but by truth. Every eye in the room turned to the mother who stood at the center of the storm. She rose slowly, her voice trembling, but fueled by a pain that had long been ignored. My child cried out for help, and you turned away. You made me feel small, invisible. But today I am not invisible. Her words broke like a wave, washing over the room, igniting courage in every victim who had once swallowed their screams. The bikers stood like sentinels as her voice filled the hall, each of them a silent promise that she would not be silenced again. The crowd's pulse quickened, hearts pounding with a mix of fury and hope. And in that instant, the judge realized he had underestimated the power of a community united, not by wealth or titles, but by the unyielding demand for justice. Outside the courthouse, the sound of engines still rumbled, a reminder that this was more than a confrontation. It was a movement. Dozens more bikers circled the building, forming a living wall that no corrupt ally or hired hand could break through. To anyone watching, it was clear. This mother was protected, this community was not alone, and the city itself was witnessing a shift it could never undo. Inside, the tension thickened as the bikers closed the distance between themselves and the bench. The judge tried to rise, but the leader raised a hand, and he froze. Sit down, the biker said, not shouting, not raging, but commanding with the calm certainty of a man who spoke for many. The room obeyed that voice, not because of volume, but because of the undeniable conviction behind it. Then came the moment that silenced even the restless crowd. The child, small and fragile, stepped out from behind his mother's legs. His little voice pierced the courtroom. "Why did you want him free? He hurt us." The innocence in those words struck harder than any accusation, stripping away every mask the judge had worn. No law degree, no years of power could defend him from the raw truth spoken by a child. Gasps filled the air. Some wept, others clenched fists, but all understood the weight of that single question. It wasn't the bikers who cornered the judge. It was the undeniable innocence of the very life he had failed to protect. And as that silence deepened, the courthouse no longer felt like a chamber of law, but a place where the soul of the city was being tested. The judge sank back in his chair, pale, shaken, his authority shattered. And though no verdict had been read, everyone in that room knew justice had already begun to shift. It was no longer about legal documents or polished speeches. It was about truth, raw and unrelenting, spoken by those who had been forced into silence for too long. The tension grew heavier, not because of violence, but because the truth itself was suffocating the room. The bikers did not need weapons or threats. Their presence alone was a shield for the mother and her child, a reminder that justice was more than ink on paper. Every heartbeat echoed in the silence, and with each passing second, the judge's composure crumbled further. He had built his empire on fear, but now it was fear that consumed him. One of the bikers, older, with gray streaks in his beard and eyes that had seen too much, stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of experience, steady and deliberate. "I was once a boy like him," he said, pointing to the child. "And men like you turned away. You let monsters walk free. Do you know what that does to a child? It teaches him the world doesn't care. But today we show him the world does care." His words rang with a sincerity that no courtroom could deny. The crowd shifted, whispers rising as victims began to share their pain openly. A man with trembling hands recounted how his pleas were ignored years before. A woman, tears streaming down her face, confessed that she had lost hope until that very moment. One after another, voices rose, not in chaos, but in solidarity. What had been a courtroom filled with despair transformed into a sanctuary of testimony. The bikers didn't interrupt. They didn't dominate. They stood as witnesses, their silence amplifying every story told. It was as though the walls of the courthouse had finally been forced to hear the cries they had long muted. Even those who had once doubted the bikers now saw them not as outlaws, but as guardians of voices that could no longer be ignored. The judge, surrounded by a sea of truth, had nowhere to escape. His silence screamed louder than words, his guilt etched into every twitch of his face. What he once controlled was slipping away, not through rebellion, but through the undeniable force of a community united by suffering and strengthened by courage. The child clung to his mother's hand as she continued to speak, her voice no longer trembling but steady, almost fierce. "You thought you could silence us with your power. But look around, Judge. We are not afraid anymore." Her defiance was contagious, spreading like wildfire until the entire crowd seemed to breathe as one. For the first time, the people were not begging for justice, they were demanding it. The biker's leader nodded toward the mother, acknowledging her courage. He turned back to the judge and declared, "This is bigger than you, bigger than us. This is about the soul of the city. And you, who are meant to guard it, try to sell it." His words were not shouted, but every syllable carried the weight of a hammer striking steel. The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices filling the room with undeniable power. The judge slumped deeper into his chair, his robe suddenly nothing more than fabric, no shield, no armor. His authority dissolved as his corruption was laid bare, and the fear he once inspired turned to contempt. The people no longer saw him as a figure of power, but as a man stripped of dignity, cornered by his own deeds. Outside, the sound of engines thundered louder, almost like an anthem of resistance. The bikers who remained on their motorcycles revved in unison, a signal to the city that justice was being rewritten. The courthouse, once feared for its cold rulings, now stood as the birthplace of something far more powerful, hope. And in that moment, every person present understood that they were witnessing history. Not the kind written in textbooks or recorded in speeches, but the kind etched into memory. The day when ordinary voices, protected by unlikely guardians, reclaimed justice from the grip of corruption. The courthouse walls seemed to vibrate with the collective strength of those who had been silenced for too long. For the first time, the judge faced not just one case, not just one family, but the fury and pain of an entire community. His arrogance, once an impenetrable mask, now cracked beneath the weight of their stares. He was not the wielder of power anymore. He was the defendant, and the people were the jury. One of the bikers slammed his fist against the wooden bench, not in violence, but as a call for truth. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising like a battle cry. "We ride not for glory, not for fear, but because we remember what it's like to be abandoned. And we swore no child, no mother, would ever stand alone again." His declaration ignited the crowd, who erupted in applause, shouts, and tears, their voices filling the chamber with undeniable fire. The mother, emboldened by the unity surrounding her, raised her child in her arms. "This is my reason," she said, her eyes fixed on the judge. "And you tried to take his safety from me. You thought you could break us. But look at us now. We are unbroken." Her words carried across the room like an anthem, a declaration of resilience that no law could suppress. Even those who had doubted the bikers' motives now found themselves moved by the unshakable loyalty they displayed. Outsiders saw rough exteriors, leather jackets, and roaring engines. But within those men burned a compassion fierce enough to stand against corruption, a compassion the system had long abandoned. It became clear that justice was not always found in courtrooms. It was often carried in the hearts of those willing to fight for it. The judge lowered his eyes, unable to meet the gaze of the very people he had failed. His silence betrayed him, each second proving his guilt more than any testimony could. And while the gavel still sat at his side, polished and untouched, it no longer symbolized control. Justice had shifted. It now belonged to the people. The atmosphere grew heavier, yet it was charged with something undeniable: empowerment. Victims who once walked in with bowed heads now stood taller, fueled by the defiance echoing through the room. Every tear, every testimony, every voice raised had woven a tapestry of resistance that no decree could unravel. The courthouse was no longer the judge's fortress. It had become the people's ground. The gang leader raised his voice once more, not in anger, but in solemn resolve. "You can hide behind titles, but you cannot hide from truth. And truth has a way of cornering even the strongest walls. You thought we were here to threaten you, Judge. No, we are here to remind you, and the world, that justice belongs to those who suffer, not to those who profit from it." His words landed like thunder, shaking even the hardest skeptics. The child, still nestled in his mother's arms, whispered, "Are we safe now?" The simple question silenced the room. Every biker, every victim, every parent turned their gaze toward the little boy. His words embodied the reason they were all there. Not revenge, not chaos, but safety, dignity, and the hope of a future untainted by corruption. The bikers as one, dozens of them, pounded their boots on the floor in unison, the sound echoing like a drumbeat of solidarity. "You are safe," the leader declared, his eyes fixed on the boy. And for the first time, the child smiled faintly, his innocence restored not by the system, but by the courage of men who had chosen to stand where others had turned away. The judge's face turned ashen, his composure gone, his power shattered. The courthouse trembled, not from violence, but from the undeniable realization that the people had reclaimed their voice. And though no official sentence had been read, everyone in that room knew the outcome. Corruption had been cornered, and justice had finally begun to breathe again. The city outside had begun to gather as word spread like wildfire. Crowds lined the courthouse steps, drawn not by spectacle, but by the feeling that history was unfolding before their eyes. Mothers held their children tighter, young men and women raised their fists in silent solidarity, and elders nodded as if to say, "We have waited for this moment our whole lives." The sound of engines outside merged with the voices within, creating a symphony of defiance that no walls could contain. Inside, the judge's voice finally cracked as he tried to speak. "You have no authority here," he stammered, his once commanding tone reduced to desperation. But the crowd laughed, not cruelly, but knowingly, as if his words were the faint cries of a man clinging to a sinking ship. Authority had shifted. Power had changed hands. He was no longer a figure of fear. He was a symbol of betrayal exposed for all to see. One of the bikers stepped forward and pointed directly at the bench. "You see, Judge, authority is not about robes or gavels. Authority is earned by protecting the innocent, by standing for what is right. And today, you have shown the world that you have none." His words struck the chamber like lightning, and cheers erupted, echoing through the marble walls. The mother stood tall, her child still in her arms. Her tears no longer came from fear, but from the overwhelming tide of courage that now surrounded her. She whispered to the boy, "Look around. These people, these men, they fight so that you can grow without fear." The boy nodded, his small hand clutching her tightly, as if he understood that his world had changed forever. The bikers did not gloat, nor did they revel in the judge's downfall. Instead, they turned their gaze outward, toward the people. Their purpose had never been vengeance. It was justice, justice carried in leather jackets and thunderous engines, justice carved into the promise that no voice would go unheard again. The final blow did not come from fists or fury, but from unity itself. The people rose to their feet, their voices merging into one overwhelming sound: the demand for truth, the cry for justice, the rejection of corruption. The courthouse became a cathedral of defiance, its foundations echoing with the chants of those who had reclaimed their dignity. No ruling, no verdict, no decree could ever erase what was happening in that moment. The judge slumped further into his seat, eyes darting as if searching for an escape. But there was none. He was cornered not by bikers, but by truth, by the very souls he had failed to protect. The robe on his shoulders now felt heavier than chains, and the silence of his guilt spoke louder than any defense he could muster. The gang leader took one final step forward. His voice, calm yet unyielding, cut through the air. "Remember this day, not because we stood here, but because they stood here. The mothers, the children, the forgotten. This is their day, and it will be remembered long after you are gone." The crowd roared, their voices blending into a sound that shook the very essence of the courthouse. The child, wide-eyed, raised his small hand as though making a promise. "We're not scared anymore," he said. The room fell silent again, and for a heartbeat, everyone breathed as one. That single sentence was the true verdict: innocence reclaiming its place, courage defeating fear. And as the bikers stood guard, the people realized the truth. Justice had not been restored by laws or papers, but by hearts that refused to be broken. The city would never forget the day a corrupt judge was cornered, not by force, but by the power of voices united. And from that moment forward, every engine's roar would remind them that hope still lived, carried on the wheels of those who dared to defend the innocent. That day in the courthouse was not just about a single case or a corrupt judge. It was about proving that silence can be broken and fear can be conquered. What began as despair transformed into a moment of unity, where mothers, fathers, children, and even unexpected protectors rose together. It showed that when people stand side by side, no title or robe can suppress the truth. The bikers did not rewrite the law, but they reminded the world of something far greater. Justice is not a privilege for the powerful, but a right for the vulnerable. Their engines may have been loud, their presence intimidating, but what truly spoke louder was their loyalty to those who had been forgotten. They turned a courtroom into a stage for truth, and their defiance became a beacon of hope. For the mother and her child, it was the day they stopped being victims and became symbols of resilience. For the community, it was the proof that unity has more force than corruption ever could. And for all of us watching, it is a lesson we cannot afford to ignore, that courage does not always wear a uniform or carry a badge. Sometimes it rides on two wheels, carrying the voice of the people. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, where do you stand when injustice rises? Do you look away, or do you lend your voice, your strength, to those who need it most? Because in the end, change is not built by the powerful, it is forged by the brave. And bravery, as we saw, is contagious. If this story moved you, let your voice join the movement. Share your thoughts in the comments. Give this video a like to show your support. and subscribe to the channel so that together we can continue to uncover stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power we hold when we stand united.